But in order to understand climate change, you really have to understand the carbon cycle, because climate change is an alteration of the carbon cycle. You've heard of cycles before. You've probably heard of the water cycle. You kind of learned that since really you're a kid. With their water cycle, pretty easy, right? You have water on the ground, so this could be a lake, a pond, the ocean. It evaporates. Here it is in the clouds. And then once in the clouds, it rains down to surface water. So really easy. The carbon cycle, unfortunately, I guess for you when learning it, is not very cyclical like this. The carbon cycle is a lot more complex, mainly because we find carbon in so many different forms. So here's an example of a carbon cycle. This is actually a pretty simplified version. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to draw it or anything like that. But instead, what we're going to do is learn about, learn about different processes that happen that move carbon from one place to another. Carbon doesn't travel everywhere in, its lifetime. It could stay somewhere for a long period of time. So there are 5 major ways and locations we can find carbon in the world. So the first one, the atmosphere. In our atmosphere, carbon exists in the form of carbon dioxide. There are some other compounds that have carbon in it, but carbon dioxide is the majority of those compounds. So we breathe this carbon. Carbon can also be found in organisms. So all living things, whether it's bacteria, animals, plants, they all have carbon in their tissues. You and me, we have tons of carbon in our tissues. This carbon is in all sorts of forms. Our muscles have tissues, the fat has tissues, our organs have carbon. So all of these different things have carbon in them. Same with our plants as well. A plant is mainly carbon. Another one is fossil fuels, which we'll touch on more when we talk about climate change. But fossil fuels, such as coal, natural gas, and oil, all of these things used to be living organisms at one point. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But because they used to be living organisms, they too have tons of carbon in them. And it's actually that carbon that allows us to get energy from these fuels. Our oceans are a huge source of carbon. The oceans are actually the place where most of the carbon in the world is found, which is really, really great for us because it acts kind of as a carbon store. We might add carbon to the atmosphere, but a lot of it gets stored in the oceans. So you should make a note of that, so that oceans have the most. Carbon exists in the oceans in a couple different forms. It can be carbon dioxide gas, so little air bubbles. There's different minerals like carbonate that we'll talk about more when we talk about ocean acidification. But oceans have tons of different forms of carbon and lots of it. And then finally, we can find lots of carbon in our soil. When organisms die, that carbon has to go somewhere. So it gets incorporated into the soil to then eventually be re-picked up by plants as minerals. So again, these are 5 different places that we find carbon, but just because there's carbon in fossil fuels doesn't mean it's going to move somewhere else. It may stay as fossil fuels for hundreds of millions of years. So it's not like the water cycle where water's always moving through it. Carbon can sometimes move and sometimes doesn't. Now the way carbon moves, scientists have classified it into 2 major pathways, fast carbon pathways and slow carbon pathways, mainly to describe how quickly is carbon moving from one place to another. So when we talk about a fast carbon pathway, this is saying that carbon is removed and added and moved quickly. It says to the atmosphere, but really to any of those places. So to the oceans, to soil. And by fast, we mean whether it's seconds, minutes, days, years, decades. Decades may seem like a long time. You're like, well, that's not very fast. But our slow carbon pathways will be thousands of years, millions of years. So decades, relatively fast. A lot of these fast carbon pathways you actually know. We've learned about them in this class so far. So number one, taking carbon dioxide out of the air, out of the atmosphere. This process, hopefully this looks familiar to you, this is photosynthesis. With photosynthesis, plants are taking carbon dioxide, so this carbon that's in the atmosphere, it takes that carbon dioxide and it turns it into glucose. Glucose has this carbon in it. That glucose then gets incorporated into the plant. So we go atmosphere, then photosynthesis happens, and then it ends up in organisms. In this case, it's ending up in plant organisms. And this happens quickly. Anytime the sun is shining, anytime you have plants, photosynthesis is happening. So this fast carbon pathway is, could be seconds for it to happen. And so carbon is moving from one location to another location relatively quickly. Another fast carbon pathway is then releasing carbon dioxide back into the air. And you know this process too. Remember, the opposite of photosynthesis, so to speak, is cellular respiration. Every time a plant undergoes cellular respiration, anytime a human undergoes cellular respiration, we are releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So here's that equation for photosynthesis again. Remember, cellular respiration is just the opposite. Here we have our glucose. This glucose was in our body. This might have been food we ate, but that food we ate was an organism. We ate an organism, then our bodies converted that into energy, and as a byproduct, we've got carbon dioxide, which then goes back into the atmosphere or back into the air. And again, every time we exhale, this is happening. We're taking carbon that wasn't an organism and putting it back in the atmosphere. Another fast carbon pathway that maybe you're not too aware of is the atmosphere and the ocean. And they're in equilibrium with one another. And what I mean by that, and it kind of shows this really well right here, is that whatever is in the air, whether it's oxygen, whether it's nitrogen, whether it's carbon dioxide, whether it's anything, whatever is in the air actually is in equilibrium in the ocean. So what that means is that if I had 20 molecules of oxygen in the air and 0 in the ocean, what would happen is some of this oxygen would go into the ocean, so that eventually we had 10 oxygen here and 10 oxygen here. The ocean and the atmosphere are at equilibrium, meaning whatever's in the atmosphere wants to match what's in the ocean. And this is done by simple diffusion. What diffusion is imagine you light a candle. At first, it smells really good right around that candle, but eventually, that candle smells the entire room because all of that smell particles around the candle diffused. It wanted to be in equilibrium with the rest of the room. Same exact thing here with gases in our atmosphere and gases in the ocean. So with carbon dioxide, if we have, let's do it over here. If we have 20 molecules of carbon dioxide here, and we had 10 molecules of carbon dioxide in the ocean wants to be in equilibrium. The air wants to be in equilibrium. So carbon dioxide moves back and forth until they are at equilibrium. In this case, until they both have 15. So they just want to be equal. And this is happening really instantaneously. If there's a small change in the atmosphere, you'll see a small change in the ocean. If there's a small change in the ocean, you'll see a small change in the atmosphere. This is really great with global climate change because we're adding a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But fortunately, a lot of it is also going into the oceans. Kind of fortunately. We'll talk about some downsides to that. Our last fast carbon pathway is decomposition. Decomposition is when organisms such as fungi or bacteria are breaking down dead organisms. They then poop out those nutrients, some of those nutrients being carbon nutrients because there was carbon in that organism, And if they're somewhere like in a forest or in a grassland or somewhere with soil, that carbon just gets incorporated into the soil. Those nutrients are then available to plants and other species. Eventually, might be taken up by a plant or could stay in the soil for a while. Now, decomposition takes a long time. Decomposition can be very quick, like a year. It can also be 10, 20 years for something to completely decompose. So although that seems like a long period of time, it's not, at least not in the grand scheme of things, because it's still in our lifetime, whereas our slow carbon pathways will be a lot longer than that. So with our decomposition, what you have is you have this organic matter, this carbon matter. This carbon matter is in an organism. That organism dies, it decomposes, and then it ends up here in the soil.